Imagine being sold at age 12 to satisfy the sexual appetites of Rome's elite. Your childhood stolen and your body transformed into a commodity for the pleasure of men who owned you like furniture. Picture a world where beautiful boys were castrated, trained in seduction, and forced to perform for emperors and senators who saw them not as human beings, but as living art objects designed for their entertainment and gratification. This is the hidden story of Rome's boy concubines, the pueri delicati whose existence reveals the darkest side of an empire that history often glorifies. What happened to these children wasn't just slavery, it was the systematic creation of human dolls, whose only purpose was to feed the sexual fantasies of the most powerful men in the ancient world. Before we expose one of history's most disturbing institutions, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the truth about Rome's boy concubines reveals how absolute power corrupts absolutely, especially when children are involved. The Forum Boarium in ancient Rome served as more than just a cattle market. It was also the primary location where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, including the beautiful boys who would become concubines for wealthy Roman men seeking exotic pleasures that reflected their power and sophistication. The slave traders who specialized in providing these children understood exactly what their elite customers wanted. Boys between the ages of 8 and 14 with delicate features, fair skin, and an androgynous beauty that could be molded to suit their master's fantasies. The selection process for potential concubines was methodical and dehumanizing, as buyers examined children with the same detachment they might use when purchasing horses or expensive artwork. Physical beauty was paramount, but traders also looked for intelligence, musical ability, and the capacity to learn the complex social skills that would make these boys entertaining companions as well as sexual objects. Boys from Greece, Gaul, Germania, and other conquered territories were particularly prized for their exotic appeal and perceived refinement. Marcus Antonius Primus, a wealthy senator, walked through the slave market on a warm spring morning in 78 AD, searching for a special acquisition that would enhance his reputation as a connoisseur of beautiful things. He was looking for what Romans called a puer delicatus, a delicate boy who would serve not just as a sexual partner, but as a living symbol of his wealth, power, and sophisticated tastes. Such boys were status symbols as much as they were objects of desire, representing their owner's ability to afford the most exclusive and expensive forms of entertainment. The boys selected for this fate came from various backgrounds, but all shared the common tragedy of being torn from their families and previous lives to serve the sexual appetites of their purchasers. Some were children of defeated enemies, taken as spoils of war and sold to recover the costs of military campaigns. Others were the offspring of poor families who sold their children to slave traders in exchange for enough money to survive harsh economic times. Still others were kidnapped by professional child traffickers who understood the lucrative market that existed for beautiful young boys. The price of a high-quality boy concubine could exceed the annual salary of a skilled craftsman, making them accessible only to Rome's wealthiest citizens. The most expensive boys were those who combined physical beauty with musical talents, linguistic abilities, or other skills that would make them valuable as entertainers and companions, in addition to their sexual function. Some wealthy Romans maintained entire households of such boys, creating harems that served both their personal pleasure and their social status. The legal framework surrounding the purchase and ownership of boy concubines was surprisingly sophisticated, with detailed contracts that specified the boys' duties, the conditions of their service, and the rights and responsibilities of their owners. These documents treated children as property while establishing the legal protections that would ensure their value as investments was maintained over time. The psychological impact on the boys themselves was rarely considered in these transactions, as Roman law and culture viewed slaves as objects rather than people with feelings, dreams, or rights. The trauma of being separated from their families, sold like animals, and forced into sexual servitude was simply the price of conquest and the natural order of a world where power determined humanity. Once purchased, young boys destined to become concubines underwent a systematic transformation designed to erase their previous identities and replace them with carefully crafted personas that would maximize their value as sexual and social companions. This process, which Romans euphemistically called education, was actually a form of psychological and physical conditioning that turned children into living dolls programmed to serve their masters' every desire. Gaius, a 12-year-old boy from a Celtic tribe, found himself in the villa of Senator Marcus Antonius Primus, where his education began immediately upon his arrival. The first step involved stripping away of everything that connected him to his former life. His name was changed to the more Roman-sounding Alexios. His native clothing was burned, and he was forbidden to speak his tribal language or mention his family. This systematic erasure of identity was designed to break his psychological connection to his past and make him more malleable to his new role. The physical transformation that followed was even more traumatic and permanent. Many boy concubines were castrated to preserve their youthful appearance and soprano voices, a procedure that was performed by skilled surgeons who understood the importance of keeping their valuable merchandise alive and functional. The castration served multiple purposes. It prevented the boys from developing adult male characteristics that might reduce their appeal. It eliminated the possibility of them fathering children who might complicate inheritance issues, and it psychologically reinforced their status as objects rather than people. The educational curriculum for boy concubines was designed to create perfect companions who could entertain their masters intellectually, artistically, and sexually. Boys learned to read and write in both Latin and Greek, studied poetry and philosophy, and were trained in music, dance, and the arts of conversation. They learned to play various musical instruments, particularly the lyre and flute, and were taught to sing in ways that would please sophisticated Roman audiences. Sexual education was a central component of their training, as boys were taught specific techniques designed to pleasure their male owners. This instruction was provided by experienced slaves or freedmen who had once served in similar roles, creating a cycle where victims became complicit in the abuse of the next generation. The boys learned not just physical techniques, but also the psychological skills needed to feign enjoyment and enthusiasm for activities that were being forced upon them. Social training was equally important, as boy concubines were expected to move gracefully through elite Roman society without embarrassing their owners or revealing the true nature of their relationship. They learned proper etiquette for various social situations, how to engage in witty conversation without appearing too intelligent or independent, and how to display just enough personality to be interesting while remaining completely submissive to their master's will. The boys were also taught to manage their own emotions and reactions, learning to suppress any signs of distress, homesickness, or resistance that might displease their owners. They were trained to smile constantly, to express gratitude for their situation, and to compete with other concubines for their master's attention and favor. This psychological conditioning created a form of Stockholm syndrome, where the boys learned to identify with their abusers as a survival mechanism. The entire process typically took 2 to 3 years, during which the boys were gradually introduced to their sexual duties while continuing their other forms of education and training. The daily life of a boy concubine in a wealthy Roman household was a carefully orchestrated performance, where every moment was designed to serve their master's pleasure, comfort, and social standing. These boys existed in a strange liminal space between luxury and slavery, surrounded by beautiful objects and expensive comforts, while having no control over their own bodies, emotions, or futures. Alexios's typical day began before dawn with an elaborate grooming ritual that could take several hours to complete. His body was bathed in perfumed water, his skin oiled and massaged to maintain its softness, and his hair arranged in the complex styles that were fashionable among Roman youth. Cosmetics were applied to enhance his natural beauty, kohl around his eyes, rouge on his cheeks and lips, and powder to create the pale complexion that Romans associated with nobility and refinement. The clothing worn by boy concubines was designed to emphasize their beauty while clearly marking their status as sexual objects rather than free citizens. Alexios wore silk tunics that clung to his slender frame, jewelry that sparkled when he moved, and sometimes women's clothing when his master wanted to emphasize his androgynous appeal. Every aspect of his appearance was calculated to create a specific effect, from the perfumes he wore to the way he walked and gestured. The boy's presence was required at all of his master's social functions, where he served multiple roles as entertainment, status symbol, and conversation piece. At dinner parties, Alexius would recite poetry, play music, or engage in witty banter with guests while serving wine and delicacies. His training allowed him to participate in sophisticated discussions about literature, philosophy, and politics, but always from a position of charming deference that never challenged the authority of the adult men around him. The sexual demands placed on boy concubines were both routine and unpredictable, as they were expected to be available for their master's pleasure at any time of day or night. Alexios learned to read his master's moods and desires, anticipating needs before they were expressed and providing exactly the type of companionship that was wanted in each moment. This could range from simple physical comfort to elaborate sexual performances designed to entertain groups of guests. The psychological toll of this existence was enormous, though it was never acknowledged by the Romans who benefited from the boy's services. Alexios and others like him learned to dissociate from their own experiences, creating mental barriers that allowed them to perform their duties while protecting some small part of their inner selves from complete destruction. They developed complex relationships with their masters that combined genuine affection with strategic survival behavior. Competition among concubines within the same household was intense and often deliberately encouraged by masters who enjoyed watching their beautiful boys compete for attention and favor. This created additional psychological pressure as boys learned to view each other as rivals rather than potential allies in their shared suffering. The isolation experienced by boy concubines was particularly cruel, as they were cut off from normal human relationships and prevented from forming meaningful connections with anyone who might offer emotional support or validate their humanity. They existed in a bubble of artificial luxury that masked their fundamental powerlessness and the systematic violation of their human dignity. The fate of boy concubines as they aged revealed the ultimate cruelty of a system that valued them only for their youthful beauty and sexual appeal, as boys who had been treated as precious treasures found themselves discarded like broken toys when they no longer served their master's fantasies. The transition from desired object to unwanted burden typically occurred when the boys reached their late teens or early 20s, as the physical changes of adulthood destroyed the androgynous appeal that had made them valuable. Alexios experienced this devastating transformation when he turned 19, and his master began showing more interest in younger acquisitions. The boy who had once been the center of attention at social gatherings found himself relegated to menial household tasks, his elaborate clothing replaced with simple slave tunics, his carefully maintained beauty routine abandoned as unnecessary. The psychological impact of this rejection was often more devastating than the original trauma of enslavement, as boys who had learned to derive their sense of worth from their master's desire suddenly found themselves worthless. Some fortunate former concubines were granted freedom when their usefulness ended, but even manumission came with severe limitations that reflected their damaged status in Roman society. Former boy concubines faced social stigma that made it difficult to form normal relationships or integrate into mainstream Roman life. The sexual abuse they had endured, combined with the castration that many had undergone, left them physically and psychologically scarred in ways that were impossible to heal. The economic opportunities available to former concubines were limited by both their legal status and the social prejudices that surrounded their past. Some became teachers or tutors, using the education they had received to serve other wealthy families. Others turned to prostitution or entertainment, the only careers that seemed compatible with their sexual history. A few managed to establish small businesses or crafts, but always under the shadow of their past and the suspicion that surrounded anyone who had been sexually exploited. The most tragic cases were those boys who were simply abandoned when they aged out of usefulness, left to survive on the streets of Rome with no resources, no family connections, and no marketable skills beyond those that had served their sexual exploitation. Many turned to crime, drug use, or suicide as their only remaining options, their lives ending in squalor after years of enforced luxury. The broader impact of the concubine system on Roman society was profound but rarely acknowledged by contemporary writers who preferred to focus on the empire's military and political achievements rather than its systematic exploitation of children. The normalization of child sexual abuse among the elite created a culture where the suffering of the powerless was not just tolerated but celebrated as a sign of sophistication and cultural refinement. Modern historical analysis of the concubine system reveals it as one of the most systematic forms of child sexual abuse in recorded history, involving thousands of boys over several centuries and creating trauma that rippled through generations. The Roman legal and social frameworks that made this abuse possible demonstrate how easily civilized societies can normalize the most horrific treatment of children when it serves the interests of powerful men. The legacy of Rome's boy concubines serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting children from sexual exploitation, regardless of the cultural or historical context in which it occurs. The next time you see movies glorifying the grandeur of ancient Rome, remember the boy concubines whose suffering was hidden behind marble columns and golden statues. Their story reminds us that every empire's glory is built on someone's pain, and that the most vulnerable members of society always pay the highest price for others' power and pleasure. If this disturbing expose of systematic child abuse disguised as cultural sophistication shocked you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold truths about history's hidden victims, and hit that notification bell, because the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people tried to keep secret. What other historical institutions do you think hid similar systematic abuse behind cultural respectability? Share your thoughts in the comments below.